This article has been published in Japan Mission Journal. Ilkwaen Chung. René Girard and the Violent Origins of Buddhist Culture. Ilkwaen Chung holds a doctorate in theology from the University of Innsbruck. His research focuses on the social anthropological approach to Buddhism. His publications include Jesus is AntiMyth, Seoul, Hwpbooks, 2018, and Envy Society, Seoul, CLC, 2019. The following paper is based on his German book. I propose to read the Buddhist world-renouncer's absolute negation, absolute emptiness, and final leap into yogic nothingness sacrificially, in the perspective of René Girard's diagnosis of the violent origins of human culture. Following Girard, who wants to bring overphilosophical interpretations down to earth, 1986:32, I shall reread the lofty metaphysical language of this tradition against its concrete anthropological context in an Indian Monsoon Asia, Paul Muse. In Buddhist texts, the founding victim, sacred world-renouncer, seems to remain hidden from view. Only radical anthropological rereading of Buddhism in the perspective of Girard's mimetic theory can dislodge the Buddhist metaphysics of nothingness and bring to light the real founding mechanism of Buddhist culture. Tracing the surviving vestigial forms of a violent sacred, specialized in by Buddhist forest world-renouncers, I shall elaborate on the dialectic between world renunciation, undifferentiation, and world order, differentiation, and explain the violent paradox of a founding, differentiating, and world-constructing Buddhist world renunciation. Buddhist nothingness as the Dharma of a world-renouncer. In the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, the Bodhisattva's so-called non-dual knowledge is conveyed in a constant play of paradox. Their non-representational and negativistic way of thinking has been embraced by postmodern intellectuals as an escape from Western representational logic. But in reality it has little in common with armchair deconstruction and should rather be read as sacrificial in a ritual sense. Buddhist non-representational thinking follows the world-negating and sacrificial logic of the renouncer who belongs to the chaotic and undifferentiated forest. This may be correlated with the original chaos of the Greeks and the tohu wa bohu of Genesis, which are other examples of mythical undifferentiation, 1976:111-12. The Prajnaparamita literature professes to reveal to its students the nature of the Gnostic wisdom of the Bodhisattva, Zurcher, 100. The same formulas of negation are applied to all elements of the pseudo-personality, the four great elements, the six sensory faculties together with their objects, etc. No concept, no clinging to something, no name is left standing, when the last barrier, that of attachment to the idea of emptiness itself, is broken, the yogi merges into the amorphous, true nature of all elements, which is empty, 100:1. According to a 3rd century Chinese version of a Prajnaparamita text, the Bodhisattva, when practicing the perfection of wisdom, does not perceive the existence of a Bodhisattva. He does not perceive any appellation, nor does he perceive the perfection of wisdom, 101. The mind of the sage may be conceived as non-being, since it is free from all conscious thought, desire, and attachment, 102. Buddhist teaching of no-self represents the specific psychoanalysis of an egoless world-renouncer rather than general and universal psychoanalysis of normal people. What psychoanalysis shares with Buddhism is, for Zizek, 335, the emphasis that there is no self as substantive agent of psychic life. Zizek cites Lacan's mirror stage, with its notion of the ego as an object, the result of the subject's identification with an idealized fixed image of itself. The self is a fetishized illusion of a substantial core of subjectivity where, effectively, there is nothing. This is why, for Buddhism, the point is not to discover one's true self, but to accept that there is none, that the self as such is an illusion, an imposture. Self is a disruptive, false, and, as such, unnecessary metaphor for the process of awareness and knowing. The impossibility of figuring out who or what we are is inherent in Buddhism, since there is nothing that we really are, just a void in the core of our being. A world-renouncing bodhisattva in his state of liminal homelessness and egolessness is ontologically empty. Since all words are false, in the sense that there are no real entities to designate, truthfulness is literally impossible, and so lying is not seen as a major transgression but as skillful means. Language, even if it is only a convenient fiction, helps us maneuver around. In particular, it helps ontologically empty. Bodhisattvas lead empty persons toward an equally empty nirvana. Traditional Vedantic sadhana proceeds by affirmation and negation. The practitioner who takes the world-renouncing and life-negating via negativa obeys the great Upanishadic negative injunction, neti, neti, not this, to negate any and all identifications with the bodily form, thereby constantly disidentifying with his body and by extension all misidentifications with name and form, nama rupa. The practitioner will be plunged into a series of seemingly paradoxical or self-contradictory questions and declarations that directly challenge his or her dualistic experience of self and world. Advaita aims thus to overcome the finite, dualistic signification of words and experientially realize the undifferentiated absolute. Davis, 13, 19, 20, 38. By undifferentiating the common-sense dualistic and differential systems, the forest and sacred world-renouncer could be understood to attempt to represent the violently undifferentiated sacred. At the very moment when all differences are imperiled, a paradoxical reversal occurs. By virtue of being concentrated in a single individual, founding victim, undifferentiation itself is transmuted into the basis for a new difference. Girard 2004:13. The anthropological reading of Buddhist world-renouncing nothingness from the viewpoint of Girard's cultural theory seeks to understand this paradoxical reversal of the Buddhist great death into the great affirmation. According to Cons. 202, the metaphysics of the Mahayana expresses a state of intoxication with the unconditioned, and at the same time attempts to cope with it, to sober it down. The Buddhist world-renouncer's metaphysics of non-duality and emptiness expresses a yogic initiatory state of Dionysian and festive intoxication with the violent sacred. As we reconstruct the original context of world renunciation in which particular doctrines were formulated, we must reconnect the seemingly deconstructive or formal logical Buddhist emptiness and nothingness with the ambivalent and liminal existence of body-renouncing world-renouncer. Based on Louis Dumont's social anthropological understanding of the paradox of world renunciation as anti-structure and reservoir of creativity, we seek to illuminate the paradoxical dialectic between world order, differentiation, and world renunciation, undifferentiation, in light of the paradoxical order generated by the structuring and differentiating mechanism of mimetic reconciliation. For Girard, all religious rituals spring from the surrogate victim, and all the great institutions of mankind, both secular and religious, spring from ritual. All man's religious, familial, economic, and social institutions grew out of the body of an original victim. The surrogate victim, as founder of the right, appears as the ideal educator of humanity, in the etymological sense of educatio, Girard 1977:306. Levi Strauss on Buddhism. Girard is writing in the wake of Claude Lévi-Strauss's adaptation of de Saussure's linguistic structuralism to the anthropological study of societies. For Lévi-Strauss, social order is structured by differences. Girard concentrates his criticism on the structuralists' linguistic doctrine of difference, which he sees them as inflating into an absolute principle. This led Lévi-Strauss to elevate myth, based on difference, and to reject ritual, based on undifferentiated immediacy. The most basic of such undifferentiating rituals is the reconciliatory victim or scapegoat. The Dionysian indifferentiation of yogic process could be understood as sacrificial. Of vital importance to the yogic tradition is the fact that the sacrificial fires in question are gathered together within one's body. There, they serve both as a cremation pyre, by which the now obsolete mundane, social body is shown to have died to the world, and, in the post-crematory existence of the sannyasin, the renouncer, as the seed of sacrifice, which has now been internalized. It is here, in the inner fires of tapas, which fuel the offerings of one's vital breaths in the inner sacrifice known as the pragnihotra, that the practice of yoga very likely had its theoretical origins. Passing through a state of death to bodily immortality is most especially effected through the meditation of fire, here, the inner fire in which the world-renouncer has immolated his mundane body once he has laid together his sacrificial fires. White, 281-2. Girard criticizes Levi-Strauss's claim that myth embodies a principle of differentiation identical with language and thought, whereas ritual attempts to retrieve an undifferentiated immediacy. Unlike immediacy, the notion of undifferentiated, as Girard argues, corresponds to part of what goes on in rituals all over the world: promiscuous sexual encounters, the overturning of hierarchies, the supposed metamorphosis of the participants into each other or into monstrous beings. Girard doesn't agree that rituals are committed to this undifferentiated once and for all. All great traditional interpretations, notably the Hindu and the Chinese, attribute to ritual the end which Levi-Strauss would reserve to myth alone: differentiation. The Buddhist logic of non-duality can be grasped in terms of this ritual logic of the undifferentiated. For Girard, the end result of ritual undifferentiation is the regeneration of differences. He rejects the idea that the incentive for plunging a postulant into the undifferentiating waters of baptism is a nostalgia for the immediate. Rather, one drops into the symbolic waters in order to reach the shore of a new differentiation. 2004:156, 7. Similarly, the undifferentiated logic of non-duality represented by the forest world-renouncer has to be thought of as preliminary to differentiation. Davis uses a hermeneutical phenomenological strategy to see Advaita and Zen teacher-student exchanges as a dialectic between the two levels of reality or the two truths that are a philosophical mainstay of each tradition. The absolute non-dual standpoint, paramarthika, of the teacher and the relative dualistic standpoint of the pupil, vyavahara, are shown to be a shifting dynamic, in which the student is pushed to different levels of understanding until finally the idea of levels or understandings dissolves. Girard's mimetic account of the ritual process of violent undifferentiation provides a better understanding of this Buddhist meditative yogic process of undifferentiating dissolving. A standard Indian philosophical formula, found in both Buddhist and Advaita dialogues, the four-cornered negation or tetralemma, functions as a deconstructive rubric that is employed to shift the practitioner into a non-dual experiential space in which seemingly contradictory assertions can coexist in the practitioner's awareness without palpable contradiction. Non-dual characteristics of meditative awareness should be reread as an initiatory process of violent undifferentiation. In Zen, one of the key non-two pairings is the negation of difference between sasra, relative, conditioned reality, and nirva, absolute unconditioned reality. This negation of difference may again be interpreted as violent undifferentiation in a Girardian sense rather than as intellectual deconstruction. Davis, 15, 7. Buddha as scapegoat. In fact, a radically anthropological close reading seems to indicate that this allegedly deconstructive Buddhist logic of undifferentiating non-duality and emptiness can be understood as a kind of pensée savage referring to the untamed forest existence of the world-renouncer. In overcoming false divisions between self and other, Buddhism is return to the maternal breast. Levi-Strauss. For 98, placing Levi Strauss's interest in Eastern religion alongside that of other 20th-century intellectuals. Strensky examines Buddhist parallels in his thought and claims that his pessimism, detachment and introversion can be found in the Buddhist tradition as well. Both structuralism and at least early Buddhism, for Strensky, share relational ontologies, and both reject substantialist ontologies. Both are also said to dismiss the idea of an ultimate meaning in history. Strensky, 110-13. Levi Strauss's most important comments on Buddhism are to be found in Triests. Hwpbooks, 470-7, where he describes his experience of Buddhist culture in Burma in the early 1950s. In his later interviews and articles he began opposing Buddhism to the destructive humanism of Western culture. As Pace points out, Levi Strauss remained locked up in a world of abstract structures and mental schemas, in which the needs and desires, fears and horrors of human experience, civilized and primitive alike, had no place. This is nowhere more obvious than in Levi Strauss's ruminations on Buddhism. For him, Buddhism is an intellectual system, a means of explaining our experience without resorting to unnecessary metaphysical assumptions. Pace, 204. As Levi Strauss reflects on the character of his invoked, retotalized whole, the rudimentary limit language of atonement/redemption and self-denial becomes a Buddhist limit language of loss of subject in a vanishing whole, a loss, effacement, that Levi Strauss takes to be a methodological necessity for the structural anthropologist. This loss of subject, most clearly described at the end of L'homme nu, was anticipated in Triests Hwpbooks when the author proclaimed that between Buddhism and himself there could be little misunderstanding. 413. Buddhist teaching represents for Levi Strauss what was earlier summarized as the culmination of his horizontal hermeneutic, the triumph of non-being over being, and the inevitable disappearance of humanity from the impassive face of the earth. Anthropology might thus be renamed anthropology. All the journeying through the structural oppositions and transformations of myth, in order to construct the transcending whole world of reciprocity, is like so many steps on the way to an enlightenment, the realization of the provisionality of collective and especially individual being and the ultimate realization of the absence of meaning. Taylor, 243-4. Levi Strauss states that Buddhism is a radical criticism of life, which leads the sage to deny all meaning to beings and things, and abolishes the universe, and abolishes itself as a religion. 408. In my view, Levi Strauss does not know the strong sacrificial roots of this Buddhist forest logic of violently undifferentiating nothingness and emptiness represented by world-renouncing tragic heroes, Buddhas. If fire and cooked food are symbols of culture and raw food of nature, as Levi Strauss has suggested, then the world-renouncer in relinquishing fire has, in a sense, relinquished culture. The liminal world-renouncer can be said to rejoin L'homme nu. The Buddhist, world-renouncer's, language of loss of subject throws a veil of mystification around the founding mechanism and its violence. The sacrificial mechanism enacted by these Buddhist world-renouncing tragic heroes must be questioned. Levi Strauss's cultural relativity with respect to the morality of cannibalism is an instance of his principled unwillingness to engage the moral issues. This world-renouncing language of loss of subject and non-duality has to be comprehended within the initiatory context of the world-renouncer's yogic meditation. In All Rites to Passage, for Girard, the temporary loss of identity, or whatever ordeal the postulant may undergo, fits very well the undifferentiated conception of Levi Strauss, but only in a first phase which, rather than being an end in itself, is a means, paradoxical no doubt but constantly reasserted, toward the ultimate goal of ritual. This goal is obviously differentiation, since it consists in a new and stable status, a well-defined identity. The first phase belongs to the undifferentiated, which culminates in an immolation where it turns into its opposite. The end result is the regeneration of differences. The undifferentiated presents itself as preliminary to differentiation and often as its prerequisite. The Buddhist doctrine of no-self conforms to the anti-substantial and processual view of human personality that Levi Strauss shares with contemporary physiological psychology. There is a kind of abhorrence of individualism in both Levi Strauss and the Buddhists, the key correspondence between them being their rejection of the transcendental ego. Both adopt a certain anti-anthropocentric attitude. To Levi Strauss, this means that the human sciences will paradoxically seek to dissolve man. Indeed, for Levi Strauss the human person is a part of nature and structural anthropology a budding natural science. He calls the first-person singular detestable, and looks forward with bodhisattva-like vision to the subordination of the ego's claims to the objective will to emancipation of that multitude of human beings who are still denied the means of choosing their own destiny. But the cognitive powers claimed by the Buddhists are rather special, and not really comparable to those Levi Strauss draws on in dismissing the cognitive pretensions of introspection. Strensky, 125-7. The Buddhist doctrine of no-self remains specific to yogic world-renouncers and bodhisattvas. How could disorder generate order? Levi Strauss often acknowledged, notably in Anthropology Structural I, the key role played by some very ambiguous figures such as the North American trickster upon whom all the contradictions, inherent not only in disorder but in the improbable conjunction of disorder and order, appear to converge and to settle. These figures are highly exalted as mythical heroes, founding ancestors, even savior gods, but they may also be debased as cheats, transgressors, and criminals. There is something anomalous in them which bespeaks great misfortune as well as a high destiny. Girard 1976:122. Buddhist world-renouncers, Buddhas and bodhisattvas, were a kind of trickster, appearing simultaneously as a renouncer and cultural hero, as both sustaining and subverting social structure, as making and transgressing boundaries. 101-2. The two Girardian categories of differentiation and undifferentiation can be applied to the anthropological dynamic of gift exchange between the world-renouncer and the worldly householder. Strensky argues that Levi Strauss's theory may be applied to the formation of Buddhist society, to the domestication of the Sangha. From the days of Moss's analysis of the gift we are sensitive to the societal dimension of giving. The Buddhist world-renouncer is supposed to be a paradigm of non-reciprocity, Strensky, 144, and can be seen as a kind of sacred exception taking the role of the founding victim. The mimetic crisis can be resolved through a still mimetic but unanimous transfer against an arbitrary victim. The victim should acquire in retrospect all the features which are ascribed to the ambiguous mediators of mythology. For Girard, the victim becomes the signifier of all relations between the members of the community, especially the worst and the best. We can understand, then, why all religious prescriptions can be referred to that ambiguous mediator, the prohibitions because their purpose is to avoid a recurrence of the crisis which the victim embodies, the rituals because they are a reenactment of the crisis not for its own sake but for the sake of the sacrificial resolution. For Girard, the interpretation of both conflictual and harmonious relations, inside and outside the community, must focus on the victim. Girard asserts that the religious transfer is the fundamental fact which each religious community must interpret in its own way within the structural constraints that stem from the type of collective delusion it cannot fail to be. All religious themes, according to Girard, are brought back to a single structural delusion, which necessarily transfigures or eliminates its own generative mechanism. The victim appears to embody the violence of the crisis, interpreted as a bad and disruptive sacrum, but metamorphosed by the expulsion into something still dangerous but beneficial and constructive, provided it is used in the right place, at the right time, and in precisely measured quantities. The violently sacred forest world-renouncer as the differentiating victim appears to embody the Dionysian undifferentiated, as in the reversal of values effected by specialists of the sacred during the festivals. Dumont 1980.